So you might be thinking about building a new PC or maybe upgrading the GPU in an old PC, and you're thinking, well, graphics cards prices are down. The RTX 3050 is the cheapest of the 30 series. Should that be where I go, or is it worth stepping up to the RTX 3060? You might also consider the AMD RX 6600, and I've done a video comparing the 3050 to that one as well. The 3060 is a bit stronger, and while the MSRPs are the same with the 6600, it generally does actually sell for more. And that's one thing to consider here, is that the 3050 I can spot occasionally for its MSRP of $250. That's actually how I bought mine, and you can see the EVGA XC Black that I'm using in this video. And I do use my cards out there out of the box settings when I benchmark them here. And you can see it up against the ROG Strix 3060, which I believe does have a small factory overclock out of the box. It's not going to make some kind of mind-blowing difference, but do keep in mind it's a very high-end cooler design on this particular 3060 in this video. But the point is, what are you actually getting by spending more? Because the 3060s don't really sell for their MSRP of $330, at least that I can find staying in stock for any reasonable amount of time. Usually they're sitting closer to $400, and the better deals are closer to $380 and are available but do sell out fairly quick, at least currently if you're watching this video as of the time of filming. What do you get for that extra $80 to $100+ difference, depending on the exact prices when you're buying? Because you can look at this in terms of relative performance at the same settings, and we will certainly do that. I'll do some like-for-like comparisons. We also see some things like what you can see behind me here, which is, okay, how far do you have to drop the graphics settings on the 3050 to match the performance in the same game on the 3060? Or maybe use DLSS. How aggressively can you do that? Can either of these cards work at 1440p, or maybe you occasionally hook your PC up to your 4K TV and you'd be interested in some budget 4K gaming? Can DLSS get there? What kind of settings do you need? We'll look at all of that in this video. We'll even throw in a little bit of ray tracing as well. There's going to be a whole bunch of side-by-sides here. Hope it's interesting. Let's dive right into the benchmarks. Let's start off with a like-for-like comparison. And we'll start off at 1080p, which I think should be the main focus for both of these GPUs, although the 3060 especially could be considered for 1440p. But anyway, we're looking at 1080p Ultra settings in Cyberpunk 2077. I use this both because it has a built-in benchmark, which makes these side-by-sides possible, as well as it still being one of the more demanding graphical titles out there. It also features DLSS, FSR, ray tracing, all sorts of things that make it a good choice for these side-by-side comparisons. So we'll spend a lot of time here, but we will definitely also take a look at some other games as well. Now, as I think we can see here, it's pretty obvious that the 3060 can absolutely handle just leaving the game at Ultra and only very occasionally dip below 60 FPS, although as we can see here, it absolutely does happen. And the 3050, we definitely want to consider lowering settings, which we will do next. Let's take a look here though, and the 3060 was averaging above 60. But going down to 1080p high settings, we can see that the 3050 is still not locking to 60 FPS, although as we get outside of this bar area, it's certainly going to be easier for it to get up there. Whereas even in this demanding bar scene, the 3060 is well above 60 FPS at 1080p high settings. So this is both showcasing just how difficult the Ultra settings were. Just going down to high makes a huge frame rate difference for both GPUs, but really showing off the strength difference between the two as well. The 3050 absolutely could play the game at these high settings, but we saw that there's going to be significant dips well below 60 FPS, whereas the 3060 is giving us a fairly high refresh rate experience. Although I don't think the benchmark ever goes through the absolute, most demanding areas of the entire game. It certainly looks like you'd be above 60 minimums for the vast majority of the time on the 3060 at these settings. Take a quick look at the averages. Yeah, the 3050 was still below a 60 FPS average, and so I thought we'd take a look at the medium settings, and then let's also crank the 3060 up to the ultra settings. So for one thing, I wanted us to see the difference between medium and ultra, because the differences aren't mind-blowing, to be honest, visual quality-wise. But you can also see the performance difference between the two cards, where the 3050, I think, is outperforming the 3060 now. But again, it's medium versus ultra. It takes a big difference here. I really think I would have left the 3060 at high settings if I was playing the game myself. But I thought this would be a more interesting comparison, really just for us to see the side-by-side difference between the two graphical settings. The shadows there on that palm tree look a little bit lower res for sure on the medium settings. I mean, you can certainly find differences, but nothing seems so mind-blowing to me that playing at medium is super concerning or anything like that. And the averages now are well above 60 for both of them. Now, so we're looking here at the 3050 had a few different ways to get to 60 FPS here, so I thought we'd now compare them side by side. The 3050 could play at 1080p medium at the native resolution, or we could try staying at high and using DLSS quality, or we could play all the way up at ultra and use DLSS balanced. This is also a good opportunity for us to look at some image quality differences using DLSS at 1080p. If you pay attention to the little details here in the bar scene, as well as the mattress, the lines in the pavement, things like that, all of them alias a lot more. If you look at the fencing here as we go past it, when we come out to see the palm trees, look at the palm tree branches, you can absolutely tell that even DLSS quality, and especially balanced, have a lot more aliasing to the image, especially in motion. And this is smooth motion in the benchmark. I find it more aggravating in actual gameplay. So you can see that DLSS is not just free performance at 1080p, although it is a huge performance boost. Now, we're going to look at 1440p, and we're going to start out at native resolution and look at the medium settings. Now, why medium settings? Because that's where the 3060 was able to hit a very nice frame rate. If I was going to play the game on the 3060 at 1440p and not use DLSS, I think I would choose the medium settings, and you can see the frame rate there is very solid. The 3050 at those same settings is not unusable. Obviously, you don't need to be at 60 FPS to play a video game. But we can see that in this like-for-like comparison, the 3060 certainly is much, much stronger. And is delivering a very good medium settings experience here. And we saw in our earlier side-by-side that the medium settings don't look significantly worse than the ultra settings. And obviously I'm just using presets here, when in reality you could tweak things, look up optimized settings guides and things like that. But for the purposes of the benchmark, it was easier just to use presets. You can see, so what we're going to look at now is we're going to look at how could we hit 60 FPS. I'm also going to look at an alternative for the 3060. So on the right-hand side, we see the 3060, this time playing at high settings, but using DLSS quality. Whereas the 3050 in the middle is using the medium settings with DLSS quality. And on the left, we're still failing to stay at 60 FPS, even going all the way down to low. And you can see here that I think that in cases like this, at 1440p, the DLSS image still features some more ghosting and aliasing in motion than the native image. But if you had to use the low settings to stay at native, I think I would absolutely choose the trade-off and go with DLSS at least medium settings instead. Look at the shadow differences on the people and things like that. There's, in my opinion, some major visual trade-offs going down to low, even compared to medium in this game, for sure. And we can also see then that playing at medium settings with DLSS makes the 3050 even a consideration for 1440p. Could it be a consideration for 4K? Well, the 3060, interestingly enough, at medium settings does deliver a usually above 30 FPS experience. We can certainly see a few little dips below 30. Whereas the 3050 at 4K medium native is just not happening, guys. Now, obviously, we're going to take a look at using DLSS here. I just wanted to assess the native performance before we looked at DLSS. And the 3060 really is somewhat playable here if you want to play on a controller on the couch. And that's why I'm even looking at 4K here. It's not that you'd buy these GPUs specifically to game at 4K necessarily, but more that you might have a 4K TV that your PC hooks up to along with a 1080p or 1440p monitor your TV hooks up to. So maybe you want to game on the couch with a controller and use 4K. What kind of experience would you get if that's at least part of what you're considering these graphics cards for? Well, with DLSS, we get a much better result. So I didn't want to go down to the low settings because we saw there's a huge visual hit. So on the 3050, I went all the way down to DLSS performance, and we're getting playable frame rates, but it's certainly not 60 FPS, even going all the way down to DLSS performance. Whereas on the 3060, I can actually match that performance level and slightly beat it with the DLSS quality. And DLSS quality at 4K looks extremely close to the native image. The higher resolution you're using these upscaling techniques at, the better they usually look. And so yeah, DLSS quality compared to native 4K is extremely close. And so that means the 3060 is delivering a pretty reasonable 4K experience here. Again, it's medium settings. We're not maxing the game out or anything, but DLSS quality looks quite sharp. DLSS performance isn't absolutely horrible, but on my 4K screen, I can definitely tell that quality looks significantly better than performance does here. But neither one was hitting 60 FPS, so what if we go more aggressive on the DLSS? The only way we could go on the 3050 is go all the way down to UltraPerformance, which is now looking terrible. When I look at those bottles in the bar, just a whole bunch of things are completely shimmery and ghosted, whereas DLSS Balanced is still looking pretty good, although I certainly see more aliasing and ghosting than I do on the native image. I would absolutely consider using DLSS Balanced, whereas the UltraPerformance here, maybe if I was sitting back on my couch, I might consider it, but I mean, it's just, yeah, UltraPerformance is I think NVIDIA marketed it as, if you're gonna try gaming at 8K, because everybody does that, maybe use UltraPerformance, because it's below 1080p and then trying to upscale to 4K. It's just not working. Whereas DLSS Balanced, I believe, is still rendering above, it's definitely above 1080p. I can't remember, is it like 1270p, something like that. Anyway, they're delivering similar performance there, but clearly looking better on the right-hand side. They were both close to 60 FPS. All right, now we are looking at ray tracing. So first of all, what if we just use ray traced reflections rather than trying to turn on all the ray tracing settings? The ray traced reflections are certainly one of the most standout, immediately noticeable ray tracing settings, although the lighting and shadows certainly have a more subtle but, do look good effect, and some people would prefer those. Myself, I find the reflections to be the most obvious thing here. And even at 1080p, I think both GPUs really do have to use DLSS to get good frame rates. And the 3060, I would say, as long as you're willing to use DLSS at 1080p, which personally I prefer not to, you actually could kick on the ray traced reflections and consider that as part of your GPU purchasing decision. Whereas on the 3050, I think even using DLSS quality, and we're really not kicking on all the ray tracing, it's still a low enough frame rate that I'd just rather play at other settings. So yeah, I think the 3060 is at least arguably pretty usable here. Although if we try to go to Ray Tracing Ultra, where we use all the shadows and some of the lighting, it doesn't go up to the psycho lighting, but it does use the lighting at a high setting, along with the local shadows and sun shadows. We can see that even using DLSS quality, the 3050 is barely a 30 FPS experience, which I guess some people might use. I don't know, I wouldn't. The 3060 also is well below 60 FPS a lot of the time. So once again, personally, I would rather just not do this. You're taking an image quality hit using DLSS, so you gain something from the ray tracing settings, but you certainly lose something from DLSS at 1080p, as well as you're losing frame rate. We're still below 60 FPS here, and when you saw how smooth frame rates we could get at the native image quality, this is why I just personally am not real impressed with the ray tracing at these performance levels of graphics card. But it's certainly usable if that's your personal preference. Let's take a look at another game. That was a lot of Cyberpunk. So how about some racing? Let's look at Forza Horizon 5. And I'm using the Ultra preset rather than the Extreme preset because it still looks really good. And the Extreme preset takes a big performance hit. So this is kind of like what a lot of games would call high instead of ultra. But in this game, it is labeled as ultra. And we can see that 3050 does pretty well here, although in the most demanding areas it does dip below 60, whereas the 3060 is delivering a pretty high refresh rate experience at 1080p Ultra. And you certainly could consider using the extreme settings, although again, for me, if your monitor goes above 60, I'd probably try to capitalize on that and use the Ultra instead of the extreme. And this also gives us a like-for-like comparison to compare, which is always nice. I've also noticed that a lot of the actual gameplay in this game is a bit less demanding than some of the really choked in early areas of this built-in benchmark. So, you know, the actual game performance versus benchmarks is always something to think about. But what if we kicked it up to 1440p? Well, if we use the ultra settings, the 3060 is still delivering a pretty solid 60 FPS and up experience, whereas the 3050 is absolutely playable. But realistically, I probably should have turned it down to high settings and seen if we could match 60 FPS. But this is at least giving us a like-for-like comparison. And I started noticing that this video was getting extremely long. So if I had done all the settings comparisons like I did in Cyberpunk on all of the other games, we would be here a really, really long time. We're already here for a pretty long time. Are you sticking around for the whole video? Anyway, yeah, both of them are doing a good job here, but as we can see, the 3060, certainly at 1440p, makes a more reasonable budget 1440p experience choice, whereas the 3050 isn't completely out of the question if you are on a more limiting budget. Obviously, the price difference between these cards, when you're looking at what they're actually selling for especially, but even at their MSRPs, is noticeable. Let's jump into Red Dead Redemption 2, and first we're going to look at 1080p, and we're going to look at the maximum preset. Now, this game doesn't label its maximum preset Ultra. It has a slider where you can slide it towards favor quality versus, favor performance, and I've slid that preset all the way to the right. That doesn't mean I went to all of the individual settings in the game and slid all of them to the right, because there are a lot of settings, and some of them can be turned up above the maximum preset. But this is just the maximum preset. Anyway, the 3050 is certainly playable, but it's also certainly dipping below 60 FPS. Now, how much you care about that is up to you, but it's certainly looking like tweaking the settings on the 3050 makes a lot of sense here. Whereas the 3060, you could shoot for a higher frame rate. However, you really don't need to. There's something to be said for buying a GPU that's strong enough to just crank the settings and call it a day without having to worry about it for a couple of years until games start getting more demanding. And that's certainly something to think about when you're spending more on a GPU. Now, if we do want to tweak the settings, one option is to use DLSS. And I wanted to highlight, look at the hair here. I hate DLSS in this game with what it does to the hair. It really makes his hair look kind of checkered. And also I've noticed in this game that DLSS doesn't provide as large of a performance boost. Notice I'm all the way down to DLSS balanced. This is not even the DLSS quality setting. And we're still not quite hitting 60 FPS in this game. So given that we can't hit quite lock 60 FPS, it's pretty close. Even with DLSS here, I think it's going to make more sense to try turning down settings rather than using DLSS here. Although I will say that DLSS does clean up a bit of the anti-aliasing. This game has a This game has a fairly blurry anti-aliasing setting, but at 1080p and going all the way down to the balance setting, I don't think it's improving the overall image quality with the anti-aliasing the way it might at higher resolutions. So here we're looking at what if we turn down the settings a bit. And I went ahead and did it on both GPUs so we could see the effect that it would have. Now, HU Optimized here stands for the Hardware Unboxed Optimized settings, which are from the Hardware Unboxed YouTube channel. When this game came out, they did a series of 2 videos, which were absolutely incredible, looking at the incredibly lengthy list of graphics options that this game offers, and looking at both their visual quality impact as well as their performance impact. And they were able to come up with this optimized settings list that I'm using here, which according to their testing offered a 65% performance increase. Now, whether it does that for every GPU, who knows, but a huge performance increase at a fairly minor loss to visual quality. And we can see that here it's getting the 3050 well above 60 FPS in most scenes, although this scene isn't necessarily the most demanding in the entire game, and the 3060 becomes a very high refresh rate GPU option at 1080p here. This will also help us try out some more demanding resolutions. So here, notice that this is not a like-for-like comparison. This is targeting 60 FPS on both GPUs, which means that the 3050 is now using those optimized settings, whereas the 3060 is using the maximum preset. And it's interesting how close their frame rates are. It's also interesting to really see the visual quality difference between these settings. This is letting you see the image quality sacrifice by going down to the optimized settings, and hopefully you're as impressed as I am at those settings. Now, at night, there's certain lighting settings where I think the moonlight doesn't cast shadows and light things in quite the same way. That might be more impactful if we looked at that section of the benchmark. But at least in this section of the benchmark, I think it really is truly impressive, the kind of performance gain that we do get out of these settings. And this is really a highlight for why just gaming at ultra settings, while it's nice to be able to do that all the time, really sometimes is frankly kind of silly in terms of the performance loss that you get for making that decision. But hey, does those optimized settings allow us to play the game at 4K? Well, actually, kind of yes, on the 3060. And even the 3050 is a 30 FPS experience. The 3060 is in the mid to upper 40s in this scene. Obviously, we're going to dip in other more demanding areas. But both of them, again, this is native 4K, and they're giving a reasonable experience here. Although, personally, I don't do 30 FPS, but I understand that this, as a 4K GPU, the 3050 is an incredibly low budget option, whereas the 3060 is delivering a pretty reasonable experience here. Now you might be wondering, well, what about DLSS? Well, obviously we're going to test that out too, but I was interested in what kind of a native experience they'd give with these optimized settings, and quite frankly, it's fairly impressive what you get out of them, especially that 3060. It's totally playable there in the mid-40s. But again, 4K on these GPUs is a little bit silly to look at anyway. But what if we do use DLSS? Again, not every game features DLSS, but when they do, it really makes quite a nice option. Although look at the UltraPerformance, look at the hair, and then look at the UltraPerformance hair versus the DLSS balanced hair. This is another example like we saw at Cyberpunk. We're going all the way down to UltraPerformance. Really just doesn't quite get the job done, in my opinion. It's impressive for what it is, but staying at balanced or even performance just looks significantly better. And DLSS balanced in this game, again, at 4K, looks pretty good. I do still notice those lines in the hair, although to me it's less noticeable than it is at the lower resolutions. But also, I do think that DLSS in this game, since it replaces the temporal anti-aliasing solution that the game ships with, it actually does clean up some of the blurry TAA in this game when you're using at a higher resolution and a higher setting. I think the quality setting at 1440p actually looks pretty good, and the quality or balanced settings at 4K both look pretty good as well. Although again, the hair is a bit frustrating. All right, let's look at one more game. How about Horizon Zero Dawn? And we'll start out at the 1080p Ultra settings, where both GPUs are delivering a very good experience. The 3050 is right there at 60 FPS. As we dive into the city itself with more people, the frame rate gets a little bit tougher to maintain. But we'll see that here in just a second. Whereas the 3060 is offering a pretty high refresh rate experience here. And again, this is the maximum settings. I'll go off on a little tangent here and say I really wish we could see Horizon Forbidden West on PC, but I have a feeling we'll have to wait a number of years before Sony lets us have that one. But anyway, as we dive into the city here, I think we get a better idea of what the performance is, and the 3050 is still holding over 60 FPS, which is nice to see, and the 3060 is still holding around 90 FPS, which is extremely nice to see, because talking frame rates, for me it's around the 90 to 100 frame rate point where I really feel the difference. It feels smoother to me up to that point. Now at 1440p, the 3050 can get playable frame rates at Ultra, and by the way, the recording came out a little bit blurry on the 3050 on that one. I don't know why. I use the same settings on all of my recordings for this video, so kind of strange. But anyway, using the DLSS quality helps close the gap and get us to a more of a 60 FPS experience, whereas the 3060 at native 1440p, and this also gives you a chance to look at native 1440p versus DLSS quality at 1440p between the 3050 and the 3060 here. I do think the DLSS in this game does look quite good, and at 1440p, I think DLSS quality in most games looks quite good, although not always, some people still argue better than native on the DLSS arguments. And there's always elements of the image that you can point out, especially in still images where DLSS is better than native. But I feel like you can also point out elements that are worse, especially in motion. So in general, I almost always consider it a downgrade unless the game has a really bad TAA implementation. All right, for a little bit of final thoughts here at the end. I know this has been a long one, so thanks for sticking around. Overall, I've got to say, the 3050 will certainly get the job done for a 1080p graphics card if you can't spend more. And I think that technologies like DLSS will help the longevity of the card if DLSS continues to be supported in the games that you want to play in the future. And that always is a question mark because not every game launches with DLSS. So, you don't know. There might be a game down the road that you want to play that doesn't support it, and then it doesn't really help you, although it's certainly something to consider. I think the VRAM difference in the card, I didn't really talk about that during the benchmarks, it's nice to have 12 gigabytes on the 3060, but I don't think it's really necessary, and I think 8 gigabytes for 1080p gaming is just fine. Now, I really do think, though, that the 3060 is going to have so much more longevity as a 1080p card compared to the 3050, so you are going to probably buy yourself an extra GPU generation with that little bit of extra money, because we can already see games where you have to turn down fairly low on the 3050 to be hitting 60 FPS, and so, how long until the low settings aren't even getting you there, especially as we start to see games designed for the PS5 and the Series X without backwards compatibility in mind to last-gen consoles, things might get a little bit rough, so definitely something to think about. So if it was me and I could stretch my budget, I would definitely buy the 3060 between the two, and I do think it is worth the extra money for that added performance, even at 1080p. Although I think, don't blow your budget. If the 3050 is the top of the line, like the 250 is all you got, well then, you might look at some used cards, things like that, see what that looks like. But again, I do think it is nice to have modern features like DLSS. To me, the ray tracing is less of a big deal because while some games have a pretty light ray tracing workload, I just think the kind of performance you're getting here, and especially going into the future, you'd probably just want to focus on the good frame rates and tweaking settings down, not adding in ray tracing on top of that. But, you can get playable frame rates if you find that trade-off to be worth it to you. But if you're looking at this as a budget 1440p build, DLSS really helps the 3050 there, but not every game has it. And when you don't have DLSS in a graphically heavy title, we even saw Cyberpunk, for example, with the 1440p low settings, all the way down to the low settings, not able to hold 60 FPS on the 3050. And it absolutely required DLSS. So if we see a more demanding Cyberpunk or worse type of graphically demanding game in the near future that doesn't feature DLSS, you could be having some trouble. Whereas the 3060 handles 1440p natively much better. It's much less reliant on DLSS, and it still has it for the titles where you want to use it, or for down the road increasing the longevity of the card. Now, I don't think 4K should really be your target on either of these, but very clearly the 3060 was the better choice if you're going to be doing any sort of 4K gaming at all, maybe occasionally on your TV or whatever. So yeah, overall, I think the 3060 is worth the extra money, but maybe you don't have the extra money. And obviously these aren't the only two graphics cards to consider, but if these were the two you were thinking, you're thinking I'm buying 30 series and I'm either buying the low end or I'm buying the low mid-range, there's your comparison. I think the 3060 is a significantly better graphics card, worth the money if you have it, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.